Thank you so much, Zahed, for joining me today. Like, absolutely brilliant book that you've compiled, and so important for so many people, especially living in London, just to be represented. So, first of all, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm glad our collective effort has spoken to you and that we found the space to have this conversation.
Oh, 100%, 100%. And before we start, I've got to give a really good introduction to the lovely Zahed Sultan, who is an award-winning multimedia artist, culture producer, filmmaker, and social entrepreneur of Kuwaiti-Indian heritage. His work focuses on the intersection between social justice, technology, and culture, and has been presented across various media arts formats and IRL spaces. He is also the founder of a combined arts organization in the UK and a social impact organization in Kuwait. Zahid receives particular attention for his audio visual dance performances, which are amazing, which have been presented internationally. We're talking about the book he created, Haramacy, a collection of stories prescribed by voices from the Middle East, South Asia, and the diaspora. So, I think I've always got to ask this question, which is, what made you feel this was the right time to compile the book? And like, what is Haramasi, first of all, for the listeners as well?
Sure. So it's it's pronounced Haramacy, and it's a combination. Well, it's a play on words, really. It's a play on the word haram and the word pharmacy. Now, if you grew up in the Middle East or South Asia, the word haram or forbidden uh, is ubiquitous when you're growing up in a household, and it's used as a sort of blanket statement that once it's thrown at you, you can't really question it because it has very deep um, societal, religious, and sort of like historical sort of trajectory to it or weight to it. And so, you know, growing up, you sort of this phrase is very, like, as I mentioned, kind of present in your life when you want to push boundaries or push and you ask questions that necessarily may or may not be should be asking. And so you grow up with this sort of almost barrier put you're surrounded by, or like in the sally you're surrounded by, and it can have a lot of sort of debilitating effects, I think, especially if you're a woman growing up in our societies.
Mm.
And so pharmacy, as we know, is a space where we go into to cure our usually topical ailments, right? Sometimes they're usually deeper if you have a prescription from a doctor. So Haramacy is really a combination of both of the words, where it's a space you walk into to cure these proverbial ailments that you've kind of incurred over time, and you're now in a space that allows you to kind of ask these questions and reflect on these questions, and hopefully have them answered, or at least feel like you're in good company and a safe space to be able to tackle them and to find clarity, whether within that space or thereafter. The name came to me, which I think is an interesting story. I was invited to do a performance in Paris several years ago, and I was walking with a friend down a cobbled path in Paris. And as you know, most pharmacy signs have these like neon green lights on them with that very, that traditional sort of snake wrapped around. It's not a beaker, but
Mm.
something from a lab essentially. And it just so happens that we were walking by this one pharmacy, and um, the word P from the neon sign had blown out. So it said Harmacy basically on it. And I turned to my friend and I was like, oh, what an incredible name. What an incredible idea it would be to create something called Haramacy. And so a year later, that manifested into a residency program and live performance program. And from that program, it's I guess it planted the seed to create this book, which has been 3 years in the making, and
Wow.
alongside the development of the program, which has been kind of just growing incrementally, slowly over time, with its initial roots in London, and now we took it in the last sort of year and a half to Bristol and Birmingham as well.
Mm. Oh wow, that's amazing. I'm glad it's spread. And
Mm.
I was also I was really pleased that you also shared your own story in the book as well. Because some people won't, especially for anthology. But just hearing your background, living in Delhi and then obviously originally from Kuwait, and then so what was it like, just emotionally sharing your story?
Before I get to that, actually, I'm really glad you picked up on that because that was a. I remember I had written two parts, and the first part was very clinical, and it sort of
Mm,
explained in a much more formal sense what I explained and how I got to this idea of Haramacy. The second was kind of just purging all these stories onto a page
mm,
and then looking at it because after you sort of like had been through everyone else's submissions, it felt really sort of not dense, but it felt almost like restrictive to just put something that was clinical to start this book off,
mm,
where you pick up this book, which I think the artwork is fantastic by this incredible Syrian
mm.
graphic
Yeah.
designer who I'm working with for years. She's the original designer of the concept for Haramacy. And I didn't want the book to start off whatsoever in a space where it felt restrictive. I really wanted it to be like this journey of stories that had an arc and came back down again. And even when it came to, so the one tidbit I want to share was when we submitted our manuscript to the publisher, they had come back and after each essay, they included bios of each of the authors, which we had submitted, as part of our manuscript. So you read an essay, you had the author's bio, so on and so forth. And I was like, if you, I feel like it breaks the flow if every time a story is finished and suddenly like you're being taken to a background of somebody. I felt like the stories only need to be read as a cohesive body of work and
Mm,
then so that they sort of like roll into each other because that's how they were intended. And then once we reached the end of the book, we had the co-editors, Dhruva Balaram and Tara Joshi, share an editor's note. I shared a background on the intention and concept for Haramacy, and then each of our authors' bios essentially. And it still feels to this day that like that, it gives the book a space to have a starting point, an arc,
mm.
and then a space of completion. I mean, the last essay we have in the book is by Kieran Yates, who expresses the importance of rest. You
Yeah.
know, which I think is really powerful to end the book with. And like understanding or just reflecting on this space of what rest means. So anyway, that's a side that's a side point I wanted to share with you. But ask me maybe more precisely. Are you curious about my background growing up, or the society I grew up in, or
Actually, just the emotional impact of actually putting your story down on page. I think, it can be like it can kind of be cathartic for some people, and I guess, but at some other times it could be actually kind of re-traumatizing in a way.
yes, I think it's a really valid point you bring up. So we out of pure coincidence. So the idea for the book came about in the summer of 2019. By the time we raised the initial sort of tranche of funding and then secured all the writers, well, secured the editor first to invite another co-editor on board and then commission the writing. Um, this took us into March of 2020. And as anyone who's been alive on this planet for the last few years knows, that was the initiation of an unexpected pandemic.
Mm,
So it was a really interesting space for us where all of us were writing pieces, short stories or essays or reflections at the beginning of a period that all of us felt vulnerable in and
mm,
uncomfortable in. So we had to approach this with a lot of care from the get go, right?
mm,
Now, from a personal perspective, the pandemic for me, besides how we all collectively felt, there was definitely a sort of a particular time frame within the pandemic where I felt a bit liberated because I had
mm,
moved to London sort of 3 years before, 4 years before, and I was sort of had one foot here and one foot back home in Kuwait, and I felt slightly torn. Like I almost had this. I was on this dialysis to back home because it was what I knew. It was
mm,
my community. It was my space of comfort, but I'd made this, I guess, life decision to be present here. And the pandemic allowed me this space of detachment and allowed me to be present
mm,
here. And with that presence, and I'm sure I'm not unique in this, there was a lot of time in the first just a few months to just sit and reflect on things. And I can honestly say to you that those first few months were as a creative, as an artist, they were very fulfilling because it just gave you the space to kind of do things you may or may not have at the time to do, at another period of time in life. And for me particularly, somehow I started to reflect on this idea of generational traumas, which I can't tell you I understood beforehand, to be completely frank with you. because I don't know if I had the space or like maybe the emotional maturity to really sit down and think about it. And so, alongside writing this essay, actually, I released a song and a music video called Hindi Majnoon. And
Mm.
Majnoon, if you know in Hindi or Arabic, basically means crazy Indian. And this song is a I call it a pop nostalgia song, and I sing it between Arabic, English, and Hindi.
Wow.
And it's actually an ode to my mother, and
Mm.
it was it was it was it's a narrative song in a way. Very pop. It's a pop song, but it's a narrative song about my experiences growing up in Kuwait and being bullied for being half Indian and feeling shame for being half Indian in Kuwait, and giving respect to my mother, um, who and me coming to terms with the fact that actually being someone that's from a dual culture is actually my strength, you
Mm.
know. and and I cycle through these sort of like these very fast paced or very like glimpses of stories, and the chorus or the hook always goes back to like, if you see my mother, how beautiful she is, and
Mm.
I am this person, I am Indian, and it is a part of who my identity is, etc., etc. Now, um, I'm almost done, I promise.
No,
Putting that
don't
song
worry.
out into the world, I have this habit also on social media when I'm introducing a new body of work is to start conversations with my audience, right? Asking
Mm.
questions, like it's a collective effort. And so the first kind of poll I put up on Instagram, my stories was, did you experience bullying when you were a child? And I just
Mm.
had a flood of people writing me stories on DMs, and this, I mean, that process was so overwhelming of initiating conversations around bullying,
Yeah.
etc. And in that period, I started to share my personal stories. And one particular one, which I'll share with you, was on my civil ID card, national ID in Kuwait. I actually have an Indian name. My name is Zahed, but my Indian or my second given name is Tisha in Hindi. And
Mm.
that caused so much grief for me growing up in Kuwait, more on within governmental departments and governmental checkpoint touch points. You stop at a police checkpoint, etc., etc. And it was so overwhelming for me that I actually, at some point when I was a very young adult, tried to go to the courts and change it.
Oh wow.
And I never shared that really with anybody, but I did in these stories and took a picture of my ID card and told that story, amongst several other stories, and a few of them are in the book. So I remember sort of purging these ideas or purging these stories, and they were quite powerful for me because there was it's like you're freeing yourself, right? Like, as I don't think it's unique to me. It's like
Mm.
when you give something a voice, you free yourself from it, right? You almost step
Yeah.
aside and it becomes devoid of you. And yes, obviously it forms a part of your identity, but it doesn't define you anymore, right?
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
that's and it was almost harmonious that I had worked on this project and then I worked on the essay for the book. So they feel like they're part of that same journey. And I shouldn't probably be sharing this yet, but the next step for me that has happened with this book, and it wasn't intentional. I didn't see a link to the book. Someone brought it up. Is I'm working on my first fictional TV series, and I'm
Oh
putting it out into
wow.
the world. I have this deck, and like I've had tons of meetings, and then I'm going through iterations and rounds of like editing. But as soon as we finished the book, a few months later, we put the book out into the world. I mean, in terms of, it was actually May last year. In a few days, it's almost a 1 year anniversary.
Wow.
Literally by the end of the summer, I started working with the writer and doing what you call world building for this TV series, fleshing out the characters, the dynamics between them, their own personalities, the storyline, the act, the hero's journey, as they call it. And and when I shared it with a team member, she's like, "This feels like she could see an extension of Haramacy into this. You're going into like
Mm.
stories because even the TV series focuses on the idea of the migrant experience and this sort
Right.
of tiered or class system that you have, etc. I can't reveal what the storyline's about because it's still very early stage, but it feels like everything is linked in some sort of way and is I think more capable, or I don't say have more courage, but I think there's some derivative of that to tell stories in this space more and more and exploring them on mediums that can potentially have a larger resonant effect. and I'll stop there because I've been speaking continuously with the past.
No, that's it's fascinating, and I think that's wonderful that this is getting picked up. That's fantastic. And you spoke of characters, and I wanted to ask you, like, how did you pick the stories? Like, you mentioned you commissioned them, so were you looking for the writers, or did the writers come to you?
So I'll try and sort of go through this as briefly as possible. So when we hosted the first Haramacy program in London, I met who at the time was a young journalist called Ruva Balram, who just moved to the city. And he reached out to have a conversation because he was thinking about starting an initiative, which has really blossomed right now with a few other people
Mm.
called Dialed In. And it creates a space for the South Asian community to really experience music, dance, and
Oh,
thought around particularly the arts, um, and groups and gathers sort of South Asians together, and they're doing a really fantastic job around it. So we had a conversation, and he was sort of trying to understand how to build some sort of platform. Initially, it was like a writing platform potentially, and by the end of the conversation, I had shared with him how we had all these. You must have heard this when we were on the panel together. A lot of these young sort of writers writing in wanted to cover our program in
mm,
whichever publication that they worked for, a magazine or newspaper, and categorically they were all rejected by their editors. And so I was quite curious. I was like, well, there's all this interest in it, but nobody wants to cover it. Why is that?
mm,
And then it goes back to the space of permission and the space of like, oh, how do you like spin this narrative so it makes sense and like feeds into a larger narrative? And that's where the idea came, the book came around. So before we finished our conversation, I was like, listen, do you mind in my next funding application if I include basically a line item, potentially us maybe working on a book of stories or something along those lines, and seeing if I can raise funding, at least enough funding to commission a first body of work from like a group of writers. He's like, sure. So fast forward a few months, and I'm ready to submit this application, but we have to include, at least an initial set of names. So
mm.
Dhruva basically puts out a really short tweet on his on Twitter, asking for as an open call for writers to write in, and
Cool.
he just got bombarded with people. It was shared something like 800 times or something ridiculous like that.
Wow.
We had 200 plus submissions that he had to sift through and like then put them in, you know, um, uh, just organize them basically in a manner that is accessible to sort to whittle down. And really, kudos to him for being able to do that. And
Yeah.
so we did that collectively eventually, at later stages. And sometime around then, he asked me if he'd like to invite a co-editor on board that he works very closely with and felt would be a good addition to the team. And that's Tara Joshi, who was
Mm.
she was a writer at Galdem at the time. And
Ah,
so
yes.
yes, so collectively, all three of us went through this journey of selecting these writers. Now, as soon as we selected them, the process for us was for them to submit a concept paper, right? Half-page concept paper of what they'd like to write about. So we could make sure it's not really about making sure, but we wanted people on board who um, were in a space where they were open to sharing something personal, right?
Mm.
And um, wanted to give space to it because they felt like they hadn't found space for it before. Maybe nobody
Mm.
had really asked them this question, or was interested in it to begin with, and that felt like something that made sense for us. And so yeah, once we approved all the concept papers, I left it to Tara and Dhruva to do their thing. And like I said on the panel, I'd really only planned to like print 100 books and
Yeah.
put them in partner venues that we knew and be like, hey, at least we put something out into the world. And but
Mm.
once we finished our first manuscript, this process was very much inspired by Nikesh
Mm.
Shukla's what is it called? I can't
The
remember the
Good
name.
Immigrant.
Yes, The Good Immigrant, exactly, a collection of stories, and it was released by Unbound. And
Mm.
so I was like, well, we have this manuscript, it doesn't hurt to put it out, put some feelers out, basically, to
Mm.
publishers and agents. We had a few conversations, and when it reached the hands of Unbound, they obviously have um, experience with anthologies,
Yep.
and it just made sense. And that took us through a whole new journey of crowdfunding and you know going through iterations of editing and production and releasing. And and here we are today. Yeah.
Y yeah,
So
I'm like, it's amazing.
I think even including myself, most people don't realize. I mean, number one, I'll be completely open about how I don't want to say archaic, but like I'm going to be kinder. But the word is archaic. I think when how archaic the publishing industry is, or how
Yeah,
historical its value chain is. It's got so many steps, and it's really quite slow. You're talking about 2 to 3 years
yeah,
before you see a book from ideation going into finding it on bookshelves. And it's quite opaque throughout the process as well. A lot of the systems aren't, if you ask me, as um, streamlined as they could be. Obviously, that's different if you're self-publishing because you've got access to
yeah.
Amazon Kindle, etc. And I imagine it's plug and play. But I was um, I was very surprised by the publishing industry. I learned a lot, and I will tell you, I would think 2 to 3 times before I put out a book again.
Oh god.
Not in any particular, but I think it's like it's a definitely there's a certain commitment to it
Mm,
that is really key because and I don't mean a commitment to writing a book because that's always understood. That's the hardest part, right? The
yeah,
artist's journey to like delivering a body of work, be it a book or
yeah,
anything else. But it's actually once you've completed that book, the dedication and commitment required for everything you need to do after. And then, there is something to be said about completing a body of work, and that in itself is something to celebrate.
yeah,
But you kind of need to look at the economics of things, especially nowadays, right?
yeah.
And the amount of effort that you put into a body of work, or this, like in this context, a book or anthology, and whether it's the amount of time it's going to take to recoup this
Mm,
effort, or if it's recoupable at all in the first place, is
yeah.
something that, for me, at the juncture that I am in life, is something that I would think twice about. Does that make sense?
Yeah, completely, completely. It's yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. It's a transaction in a way, for sure. So you want the returns on it. It's which is totally understandable. But I was really curious because, as you said, the submissions that came in were extremely personal. The really harrowing accounts and stories
Yeah.
and important stories. Were there any in particular that really struck a chord with you? I think, obviously, aside from your own.
I mean, there's a lot of intentionality around helping people to sort of, I mean, I guess we can say giving them space. It's not like we gave them a voice. Everyone there has voices, and most of the people actually in the book at the time were they'd never been published before in a book,
Mm,
right? So a lot of them were journalists or writers in some to some degree or some form, excluding myself. I was probably the earliest stage of this. Well, no, there's a few of us actually, but so we're all learning while we were doing. Even the co-editors had never edited a book before or
mm,
compiled a book, as a matter of fact. So it's very much was like, okay, us coming and collectively doing something together. And when it comes to the stories, I can't pick favorites, but I think that it it's interesting to me that there's certain stories that spoke to me. There's certain styles of writing that spoke to me, and they sat with me very strongly, but for different reasons. But then I speak to others, or I saw
mm,
people who wrote in or tagged me on like a social story, and it was completely other stories as well. I thought, for instance, just off the top of my head, that Joe Zada wrote a very comical essay. Like I think his way with words and his wit is something that like I was like, wow, this really spoke to me. Someone
mm,
like Aina Khan wrote a story that to me was very powerful and spoke to me in a different way.
yeah.
And then there was, or you found, I mean, even the co-editor stories I found very moving. But I think each of them had a weight to them, and collectively felt like it was something complete when we
Mm,
sort of, wrap this process up and put it into a manuscript. We do have, I think, one of our most harrowing stories. We put it right in the dead center of the book because it felt like it was this sort of
mm,
almost upward trajectory in terms of energy, stories, and then like really just, for lack of a better word, audacity. And I don't mean that in a negative form, but really like um, there was an arc in the book, and I don't want to mention the name, whatever, because I want them to pick up the
mm,
book and find this story. Um, and yeah, it definitely felt like if I could visualize for you what this reading would look like, it's like you just kind of climbed up this hill that was a bit tough. It wasn't easy to get there, and then you reach this arc, and then suddenly, like we tone it, we dial it back slowly, 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 and end with Kieran's story on rest. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, that's very true actually. It does end with this sort of like you breathing space for sure with Kieran's story. But obviously a lot of the stories, I think even including yours, it discusses the idea of like multiple identities. So why do you think people actually struggle to comprehend multiple identities? I think this is something you also mentioned in the English pen talk, like which was the fact that we're boxed into one or another, but not together.
yeah. Why do people struggle with multiple identities? Um, I think it's tough because I think there's you can answer this question twofold, right? Because you have those that come from a single background, and then you can look at the narrative of like how do you ask them to have an understanding of something that essentially isn't part of their world or their day to day, right? And most of us learn through experience, right? If someone
Hmm.
tells you something, it's very hard to have empathy around it unless you've gone through it yourself, right? That's
Yeah.
why it's few and far between today that you meet someone that can't empathize about the pandemic because we collectively went through it. Now, if
Hmm.
only one part of the world went through it, and you told it to somebody else in another part of the world, they may nod their head and say, yes, yes, of course, but they actually didn't experience it. I mean, obviously, in
Hmm.
this fantastical world where nobody did, except for like a select few. So I think that that's my instinct is that, or my first sort of response to you is that those that don't come from those backgrounds, it's very hard to understand it because
Hmm.
it forms your identity through formative years. I just use the same word twice, but formative years of your
Hmm.
life. If you think about trying to find a space for yourself, whether it's in primary school, nursery even before that, or selecting your first group of friends and like sort of carving a space within your environment, shaping who you are with the way you dress, the way you speak,
Hmm.
what you go to, what your hobbies are, how you select a university, how you go on your first date, how you choose your partner, how you choose a job and you choose a profession, who are your colleagues, who are your peers, who you choose to mentor you. If you think about like all of these touch points, wherever you have control over them, there's a decision making process in there, right?
Hmm.
And I think that
Yeah.
your your collective experience or collective sort of programming informs how you make these decisions, right? And so
Yeah.
each of us, depending on our unique circumstances, are programmed and conditioned in a certain way to respond and to make these touch points in our lives in totality reflect who we are. So when we say my name is, it's reflective of who I am as a person and how I carry myself and how I speak and how I dress and etc. 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 So the challenge there is not so much a challenge of you know I'm me and you're you, but rather I think that the individual experience. And it just so happens, I would like to believe, that if you come from two different backgrounds, you're having two simultaneous experiences at the same time.
Hmm.
It's the nature of that. If they're especially from
Yeah.
two different worlds, right? Two different ends of the spectrum. If they're two very similar ones, I think they'll be more complementary, right?
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
you're a sponge when you're a child, and up until hopefully you're a sponge your whole life. But if you think about it, you're just absorbing all this
Hmm.
information, positive and negative, as you're sort of forming this person or this persona. And so I think we just end up having 2x the experiences. Someone who hears this who doesn't come from a dual background will possibly disagree with me because they may say, well, I can be from a singular background, but I may have had the programming to go and experience the world. I mean, my parents were worldly enough,
Hmm.
or I was worldly or intentional enough to want to go and experience things in society, and I had a 2x experience without having this duality. Fair enough, right?
Hmm.
Um, so I don't think there's a I don't know if I've answered your question. I don't think there's a right or wrong in it, but I
Yeah.
think that if A, what does that say? If A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C.
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Mm.
So I think that's what we're really talking about here is that, can if you don't have A and B, can you still get to C on your own? I think I just complicated
Yeah.
that as an answer, but
No,
hopefully
no,
it
no. I get it. Using the maths reference, even though my maths is terrible, but I do understand what you're saying. And you're right. You're right. Everyone has a different path and journey to get to where we do, and some people go and some people don't, and it's true. I
and these
can definitely
journeys are
relate to
either
that.
it can be by choice or you're sort
Mm.
of like thrust into them, right?
Yes.
Like
Yeah.
we speak about
Agreed.
home, for example, in the book, right? Home is something, I've come to a space where like, you know, to me, home is sort of is within. It's not necessarily like a physical
Mm.
space. And I'm sure there's a lot of people out there today who feel the same, who come from these sort of dual backgrounds, always constantly looking for a space to fit in, but realize, well, I don't need to fit in. I just need to be myself, right? And I'm hearing more people sort of speak in this manner, which starts to make sense to me as an individual for who I am. Um, but I think, you can choose to make a home somewhere. You can be thrust into a
Mm.
space and it's not an option for you to choose a home.
Yeah.
Um, or you can decide to make your original home your home or go elsewhere and make that your home. So,
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask you this because, my next question was, what do you think is the impact of rootlessness? Because I think there's a couple of stories that talk about separation from the origin, from the place of origin. So what do you think the impact is?
oof, tough question. Tough question because it takes me to, the rhetoric in the media today around migratory experiences or forced
Mm,
migration. And, I think that's it's such a delicate space, and I don't want to take away anything from it by simplifying it, to a person's internal struggle, you know.
mm,
But I can only speak for myself. If you
sure.
ask me this idea of rootlessness, correct? Is that the right word?
Yeah, rootlessness is a hard one. Yeah.
So my context is that I was born to a Kuwaiti father and Indian mother. I predominantly grew up in Kuwait. And the society I grew up in was a post discovering oil society, going through hypermodernization, and started to
Mm,
create these class divides. Due to that, and due to their exposure to migrants who came into the country and were essentially doing the menial work that, this newly found local rich, saw as beneath them. And so it just so happens that my mother came from a background that in the country are predominantly people who are laborers and workers, um, there to do the jobs that others won't. And so
yeah.
immediately the connection is made from a young age that, oh, um, if you have this as part of your identity, then there must be a part of you that is less than, right?
Mm,
You're not,
yeah.
you don't represent the whole like the rest of us. And so that translates into all forms of like bullying, teasing, made fun of, shame, etc., etc., etc. And so had I not been put through that, I can imagine I would have had a much more complete sense of feeling rooted in Kuwait, right?
Mm,
That's not to
right.
say because I went through that, I feel completely uprooted from Kuwait.
Hmm.
I would say I was partly rooted and partly uprooted, right? And then it took me time to process these experiences or these triggers, come to terms with them, you know, overcome them, and then I was able to complete my rootedness. Does that make sense? In
Yeah.
my in my home that I spent the majority of my life in, but also this other part of me where we also have a home in Delhi in India, and
Mm,
and find rootedness there. Initially, it was during the Gulf War when I was a child, where I made my
yeah.
first initial group of friends. I would go back and visit them over time. But then, when I, sort of embarked on a sort of career in music and started to build a
Mm,
community around Indian musicians, like contemporary young Indian musicians who were based
mm,
in like Pune, Delhi, Bombay, etc., etc. And suddenly now there's this whole other world that gave me a sense of rootedness that, like,
mm,
you know, um,
yeah.
I felt a kinship to.
Mm.
Yeah, so that's. that's my response to you. I don't know if that is relatable on a larger level, but yeah, that's how it was for me.
Yeah, no, it makes total sense. Like rootedness in community is such a big one. Roots look so different to each person, so it makes total sense that you find it in different communities. I think is wonderful actually, and you know, this is a thing. There were a few of the stories that talked about this, which is, what do you think the effect is on like people who are, first generation, second generation migrants, or just general migrants, and those from the sort of the global majority, as I like to call them,
Yeah, right.
being forced to fit and into sort of convenient narratives.
So when you say convenient narratives, are you talking about the narratives of their adopted home or the narratives of where parents want them to retain their identity and they impose a narrative on them that is reflective of their upbringing? Which one are you speaking about? Or is it a mix of
So
both?
it kind of a mix of both, but I guess with the book, it mostly talks about the convenient narratives of their adopted homes.
This is a hard question for me to answer because I'll end up attempting to speak on other people's behalves, and I don't want to
Mm,
do that. Everyone's access or experience with their own upbringing is different, and
yeah,
we all process it differently. And I think that I was not a diaspora kid until I'm a diaspora adult. I'm not a diaspora kid. And
mm,
so a lot of people were uprooted or they're second generation or third generation from a very young age, which wasn't
yeah,
my case. I had that uprootedness for a very limited period of time because
mm,
there was a Gulf War in Kuwait. I was there briefly and, left the country and then we ended up making a temporary home in Delhi. But essentially I moved back. And so it's almost like there's a small blip in my
yeah,
timeline where I was uprooted, but then I had the chance to move back. So,
mm,
but what I can say is after living in London now, it's been 6.5 years of being here. I find it so interesting, particularly within, say, South Asian, Middle Eastern societies over here, and even North African. I think that being in sort of British UK society, is such a wide spectrum
yeah,
on this notion of what my culture is, right? It's so much more wide than I've seen and experienced anywhere in the world, even. I think the idea or the identity of being Muslim, for example, here
mm,
is I've learned so much in London, particularly because once I move out of London, spaces like Birmingham, etc., I don't find it to be such a wide or colorful spectrum.
mm,
And in London, I think people have had the space to really kind of shape their own narrative and you know, carve whatever size of space they can for themselves. Now, that's not to say that they can take that space home and they can take this identity and be it at home all the time. Because
yeah,
what I've seen through our own programs is we capture a lot of we do a lot of chats with artists that we capture on video and film, which are on our website, our Moroccan art organization's website. And it seems like there's a struggle for a lot of artists from these shared backgrounds, and there's a almost like a synonymous theme with their families where there is friction, right? And
yeah,
a lot of the friction, it's just quite interesting that you hear this from sort of like people we consider as members from our community. The friction is not that they disagree with the values and principles that their parents are bequeathing or sharing with them. It's rather that they just want space to be able to explore it and understand it for themselves
yeah,
and to have understanding from their parents that, you know, we we have an appreciation for you, but we also need the space to be able to explore what that means for us in this society that you have either chosen or forced to have to, make your home, and we can't be expected to fully kind of form or morph ourselves into being a certain way for a culture or space we essentially didn't grow up in. You know,
yeah,
does that make sense? So, for example, if you're from India and then your parents are first generation migrants to the UK and their principles are important to them and maybe they come from a conservative background, and so they have expectations of you, and the expectations may weigh on you because you're born into British society, and you're in a progressive school, and you kind of want to go out and dance and do this and do that and date and etc., and go to uni and study your own topic, and that doesn't fall into the doctor, lawyer, engineer category. And so you start to have this friction, right? Essentially.
Yeah.
And it's funny that in this day and age, that's still a narrative. I can't tell you how many artists we've had on camera say that, I chose a path not to be the traditional doctor, lawyer, engineer. It's still alive and well from
Yeah.
decades now. It's still, running strong. There's jokes about it on TV, in books and film, and it's alive and kicking,
Yep.
Um, and I will say, which I find, and you don't hear as many people say this, but I find it really interesting, is that what it starts to create in terms of output, from what I've seen, and I don't want to say this is as a blanket statement for all, but I have seen it,
Mm.
is that I've noticed there's a lot of creatives or people that are expressing themselves through some form of some art form. There's a romanticizing of this culture that
Mm.
they haven't essentially grown up in, and there's like a
Yeah.
beauty in it,
True.
and it's highly romanticized through the narratives and experiences that their parents or their grandparents have shared with them.
Yeah.
And there's like this almost this yearning to go back to it,
Yeah.
right? Without having actually spent deep and rooted time in that place and space. And I think that, again, probably my two cents worth is that if said person actually took the time to go there and spend infinite amounts of time there,
Mm.
I think they'll realize how romanticized it is,
Yeah.
because they haven't had to deal with the nuances of said society. And I
Yeah.
think we'll have a higher appreciation for, you know, what their parents moved here for, either intentionally or unintentionally, to give them a better life for. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like, there's a
Yeah.
reason most
Totally.
people are here, is to give their kids a better life. And yeah, that was a very long-winded answer for you, which I seem
No,
to
no,
get
like
today. But
I could do,
yeah,
I could relate to that. I'm like I'm definitely guilty of it.
also,
We get bits and pieces of information, and so we have a different notion of what we think is like our culture, but it's not. And because we don't live in said place, we miss out on so much. So when you go back and they're looking at you strange because you've got this very different notion of it, they're just like, no, no, we're very different to what you expected us to be. So it's kind of a sort of a reverse culture shock when you go back
yeah,
to places like where you sort of originate from. Absolutely. But yeah, thank you so much for speaking with me. I really appreciate it. It's fascinating. Such an important subject as well. So really, really appreciate you like sharing such amazing thoughts with us.
they were extended thoughts in
I
several
like
regards.
extended thoughts. Yeah, I like
Hopefully,
extended thoughts.
hopefully they land. I may cringe when I listen back to this podcast, but as we usually do. But thank you for reaching out, and still having interest to speak to me after all this time. About the book, about this topic, and yeah,
No, no, my pleasure. No, it's, again, this is a subject that will continue to be interesting to me for sure. So yes, I have a vested interest for sure. So absolutely. But thank you
I
so
tell you
much.
what. I tell you what. Let's put this out into the world. Manifesting. Since I'm working on this TV series, if I'm able to like bring it to life and make it happen, maybe in a few years we can pick this conversation up again and
Exactly. No, no, I agree. I totally
build on it.
agree.
Build
I
on
would
it.
love that. Yeah, I would
Because I
love
really,
that, honestly.
as once this was sort of put to me that, oh, this TV series is an extension of the book, I really feel, because it's fictional, I truly have a space now to delve so much deeper into the nuances of this migratory experience, and I hope to
Mm,
do it collectively as well. The writing process for this TV series with several people who hail from different but overlapping communities. So I think it'll be an interesting, space to come and revisit again in a few years with the
Absolutely.
overarching, if I can, realize.
Yeah.
um,
Well, yeah, fingers crossed, and I hope it does come about because I'd be fascinated to hear how this all turns out. So, yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, thank you so much.